Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's CoveTalk live stream. I'm Major Andrew Stokes, SO2 the Cove. Before we get started, I'd just like to say for more great content like today's talk, don't forget to follow the Cove on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Spotify, and Forcenet. Today's CoveTalk is on mobilisation, and I'm joined by Major Zach Lambert and Major Dave Caligari. Gentlemen, thanks very much for being here today. I invite you to address the Cove audience.
Thanks very much. So, my name's Major Zach Lambert. I'm here today to open up this talk on mobilisation. This is a particular interest of mine. I've done a fair amount of academic studies in this, most recently a Fulbright Fellowship in the United States, where I looked into this in a little bit more detail. I have a fairly significant operational background, and previously I was in the divisional staff as the Joint Logistics Planner. With me today, I have Major David Caligari.
Good afternoon. I'm currently the Operations Officer of the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment, or 3RAR. And I've been within the Ready Battle Group now, which 3RAR is, for about 2 years. As a junior officer, I also served in 1RAR while it was the Ready Battle Group. And I've also served within the Australian Amphibious Force headquarters and mobilised and deployed at short notice to regional contingency operations in Vanuatu. My most recent deployment experience was included being in the US headquarters in Afghanistan, planning for the reconstitution of NATO forces prior to its departure from that country. And we're here to discuss mobilisation, which is a good topic. It's been in the news a bit lately. So let me introduce it. Mobilisation is the process of generating military capabilities and marshalling national resources for the conduct of military operations to defend the nation and its interests. Or more particularly, mobilisation is the preparation of forces following specific government direction for operations, activities, and actions. Mobilisation occurs across 4 phases. The first is preparation, the second is mobilisation, then the conduct of operations, followed by demobilisation. Australia is not new to this game. We've been mobilising since 1885, when Australia deployed 750 soldiers and 200 horses from the port of Sydney to the port of Sukin to participate in the British Sudan War. If we come forward a little in history, through a number of mobilisation instances, and look specifically within the service histories of those still serving, you can see mobilisation occurring across Operation Morris Dance, Operation Belle Izzy in PNG, twice to Bougainville, and then operations in East Timor under Operation Spitfire and Operation Warden. Not only that, if we go very recently, this side of the COVID pandemic, the 1st Battalion deployed soldiers at short notice after mobilisation to Afghanistan for the conduct of a non-combatant evacuation operations. And then separately, my own battalion contributed soldiers at the request of the government of the Solomon Islands to support security there in December last year. So why are we discussing mobilisation if Australia's been doing it for a while? Well, it's become particularly important, and it's all about the crisis warning time. The Defence White Paper in 2016 highlighted that we had 10 years notice before we'd need to mobilise to the largest degree and do something. However, the geostrategic context has changed, and the world is a little less certain than it was back then, and that's what the Defence Strategic Update in 2020 told us. So it has a particular extra bit of purpose now. So what are we going to cover?
So today, we're looking to cover 4 main topics. The first of all is to give everybody an overview of what the strategic levels of mobilisation look like, the stages. Following that, we're going to look at some of the more tactical components of how we might execute that. The second point that we're going to cover is we're going to look at the strategic model across all 4 stages and how it might be applied from a conceptual level. We'll then move into the specific tactical details of how it affects you within the unit and what you might expect to see at the lowest level. And then finally, we'll discuss some of the challenges that these mobilisation activities pose to all of us. We'll take some questions after that. So, first of all, I'd like to bring your attention to your screen. There are 4 stages of mobilisation. As you can see on the screen at the moment, running from selective through to partial, full, and then national. At the selective level, you can take these to mean primarily scheduled and planned operations or activities that we know are coming, that we have specific units allocated to pursue. This might include some reservists, but broadly, it'll mainly operate with the forces that we have at our disposal on short notice. When we move on to partial mobilisation, things get a little bit more serious. And this might include the activation of the reserves to a certain degree, such as what we did during the bushfire assist activities in 2019-2020. When we move further on into the full mobilisation, this looks a lot like utilising the entire ADF, as well as all of the reserves. And this is not something that can be done within the constraints of defence resources. This will require quite significant support from around the country. And then finally, the national level of mobilisation, or the national stage. This is the sort of expectation you might have had during World War I or World War II, where the entire country is focused and reworked specifically to supporting this military activity, primarily because this tends to require a threat to the nation and where the survival of the nation is at question. Now, this is one way to look at this system. However, it's not the only way to conceptualise it. Another example, you might break it down into two separate tranches, one containing selective and partial, and one containing full and national. What this might look like is, instead of these four phases, an area of defence mobilisation within defence resources and an area of national mobilisation. It's very important to note as well that none of these activities can occur without clear direction from the government. And the national level activities don't even just constrain themselves to the Department of Defence. Almost all of the other departments in government are also involved. So with this in mind, we want to break it down into a little bit more specific detail. How exactly does this work? So if you have a look to your screen, on the left-hand side, you'll see the stages of mobilisation increasing up from selective to full. On the bottom of your screen, you'll see the stress that's generated on the force. The line that's indicated here looks at the level of stress applied as you move through those mobilisation stages. And that could go from current operations, which are planned and scheduled, all the way up to a major conflict which involves the entire ADF. Now, these activities have occurred before. And so to get a real understanding of this, let's look at some examples.
I mentioned that I'm currently in the Ready Battle Group, but the reality is you don't need to be in contingency force elements to be part of or involved in mobilisation. Right now, a large part of the ADF are already contributing through various missions to support security cooperation or ADF operations. An example of those would be the mentor training teams that are going to places like Papua New Guinea and the Philippines, but as well the ADF's enduring contribution to Operation Resolute. In these instances, force packages are designed, including a number of personnel who come together for a specific mission and deploy. The next step, though, starts to be where extra preparation needs to happen. So when we move up to a more stressed force, we see the benefit of contingency force operations. And here it mightn't be clear precisely how those forces might be used, and that ambiguity makes it more difficult. So here we have a potential employment of an entity such as the Ready Battle Group to respond to a minor regional incident. The example you have on your screen is in fact what 3RAR did in December last year, where we sent a small contribution overseas at the request of the government of the Solomons to support the situation there. It does get more significant though. Again, still within the remit of our existing contingency force elements, you can move to a regional incident. And an example of that has also been mentioned, and that is the non-combatant evacuation in Afghanistan. One of the key differences here that made it a more significant event is the presence of elements of the battalion headquarters. And in this scenario, because of the size of the contribution, there was a need to transition the ownership of that high readiness element from the 1st Battalion to the 3rd after it had occurred, which was easily done with no change in the level of readiness between forces that moved roles. We then move forward to a minor conflict, which is moving up into that second stage of mobilisation. In fact, well up. Here, we can look to the example of East Timor and the deployment of Interfet there, where it consumed our ready elements and required a much larger contribution of force in order to form a task force to do operations there. We can then continue to advance where we can see the Vietnam conflict during the full stage of mobilisation. This was notable as one of the key elements of that allows us to fully see how significant this stage of mobilisation is the requirement for national service, where in this instance it was essential that the ADF expanded its force to match the needs to sustain operations in that location, which required that extra degree of mobilisation. The final step would be something many of you would have guessed, and that is a world war, where we have, as Zach mentioned, the entirety of the country geared towards supporting the military and other instruments of government to achieve what is needed in that conflict on behalf of, for our national interest. So now we'll go on. We've described the stages in theory. We're now going to look at a little bit more specifics of how this would play out.
Okay, so in order for us to go further into this topic, we need to have an understanding of how the national mobilisation effect would occur. So what we've done is we've prepared a fairly stylised and simplistic view of this just to discuss what it might look like. So as part of this, you can see we've got the phases of mobilisation along the top of the screen. You'll note that there's a big distinction between that full level of mobilisation and national level, and there's a lot of really complex activities that occur at that higher level. However, it starts at the lowest level, being the groups of teams that we create in each of the services. This might be as low as a combat team, this might be as low as an individual platoon for a specific task. Whatever is selected specifically to generate a particular outcome is what's required. Now, as this builds, we group those together into the next level up. So in this case, we're using the example of battle groups, although they're certainly not the only organisation that we could use to move from that selective into the start of the partial mobilisation. The next level is our minor joint task forces. So as we combine elements from across the services together, we put them in a position where they might have to operate in between services, and the key thing here is that those headquarters tend to be joint headquarters to generate the best effects. This is moving more towards the partial level of mobilisation. The next level after that is when we're approaching a full level of mobilisation. So this is when we start to combine minor joint task forces into major joint task forces, and we start to include specific outcomes from other departments. So for example, the entire Department of Defence becomes involved. We might get specific guidance and frankly mission command from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade if the operation is occurring overseas, or we might get some guidance from Home Affairs if it happens to be in Australia. The combination of all of these factors makes it quite a complex and all-encompassing issue, and at this stage you're starting to tap into what assets are in the national support base that you might need to support these activities. So as we can go further, we might have conducted the recall of reserves at some point along this phase at the individual or small team level, but once we move towards that full level of mobilisation, we need to start recalling the entirety of the reserve, and that can be quite a significant activity. Those reserves then plug into our major JTFs and either fill gaps or provide specific discrete capabilities and combat organisations that we specifically need to send overseas. As we move on from there, we might look at the requirement to start moving skilled reinforcements into the forces that are on operations. That might look like, for example, additional doctors or cybersecurity experts that we've arranged from their civilian jobs to come and provide support. And this might include the requirement to start recruiting civilians, particularly for those key specialist jobs. Once we move past here, this becomes highly theoretical. So for example, we may look to start involving other departments that are required and have a really strong role to play in this. Like for example, the Attorney General's Department to start drafting new legal positions for the government, the involvement of civilian industry to start retooling to provide support to the force, and potentially the Department of Finance to start funding what is an exceptionally expensive and complex undertaking. We then look at the potential of expanding our forces. So this may look towards expanding our existing Army Corps, that may look towards new air units, and potentially new or replacement ships to expand the Navy. The final stage of what a national mobilisation might look like, again in a very simplistic fashion, would be the full and total mobilisation across the force, Australia, including the Departments of Education and Health, for example, which will basically provide new recruitment streams and new capabilities that we need to reinforce long term over the course of, say, years rather than months. And we also need to start looking at how this may affect the economy and how this may retool certain civilian industries. Now, the reason we bring this model up is not to try and teach you what all of this looks like, but it's simply to say that this is a very large and very complex undertaking, even made simplistic. What we're going to look at today is we're going to really focus on the tactical level that affects us in Forces Command, particularly in the selective and partial end of that spectrum. So in order to achieve that, we'll show you another model that we've prepared. So this model will look towards specifically the use of personnel within the force.
In a world where mobilisation is required to really stress the force as we move up that continuum, personnel will be a critical component to that. So let's reflect. Australia has a number of major bases that are invaluable at the moment for training and for employing those the facilities, the ranges, the armories, etc., to prepare our forces. And fortunately, we also not only have the large major bases that often will have a brigade there, but we have a large number of smaller bases, routinely at the moment occupied by the 2nd Division staff. And on this map, in a simplified way, you can observe just some of those locations, but we certainly couldn't plot them all on a map and you'd still be able to see it. So in these bases, there perhaps isn't the degree of infrastructure, but there are still, at times, armories, ranges, there are lecture rooms, other training facilities, and then as well, often there's a cadre staff of full-time service personnel, and it's a place where frequently reserves go to train. So they're invaluable. If we look now at a generic example about how some of these major but also minor bases could be used to expand the force, we can start to visualise how that might happen. So as you can see on the screen, we've looked at a platoon headquarters as a generic entity. Here it could be an infantry platoon, but it could be something else, just simply for the purpose of this explanation. Here we have a platoon headquarters as well as sections, or at least the leadership of sections. Using this group, we can then expand into a larger organisation. So on the right of your screen is a skeleton for what is a company headquarters. In an environment where we need to expand the force, this small existing leadership team could be used within that company headquarters, but occupy more senior positions, perhaps promoted or assume roles and responsibilities a little above what they would routinely do. Here, they then form the nucleus of a company headquarters. Or correction, a company complete. The next step is to introduce additional lieutenants or some other leaders. And to do the aspect of increasing the number of lieutenants, we could look to history as to how that's been done in the past, where during World War II, Duntroon compressed its course and determined that some elements of training perhaps could be done without. And for that reason, they were able to draw more quickly on the outputs of Duntroon. But that could be done through any method of creating officers to fill leadership positions. And in fact, it wasn't simply used out of Duntroon. One of my own battalion's heroes is Lieutenant Colonel Charlie Green, who was removed from Staff College early and promoted and given command of the 3rd Battalion on operations in Korea. So there is precedent. So let's introduce them. The next step is growing the core of that institution, being the junior leaders and then as well the soldiers of that team. To do that, we can train new personnel, we can perhaps leverage the service personnel who have recently separated and would return while the organisation mobilises, or we can look to other agencies. Perhaps there's a reserve unit that could contribute those soldiers. But regardless, what we see here is a trickle down of experience and a transfer of skills from those leaders that we had placed from the smaller nucleus into this organisation, who can deliver individual training and then move forward with collective training with whatever time and resources are available to the mobilising force to expand. So let's do that now. As you can see, using this simple example, with what was simply a handful of staff that would otherwise have been any element of 4Com introduced to deliver this training, or perhaps Carter staff, or even existing leaders amongst reserve units, we can build a much larger force using this system. So let's now explore the timeline of how this might actually work.
So for most of the people streaming in today, the most interesting part of this is to talk about how it affects you, how it affects a specific unit in your situation. Now what we've done is created a bit of a timeline and a bit of a model to explain this. So if you take a look at your screen, you'll see on the left, you've got an increasing level of readiness. Along the bottom, you've got a period of time. On the right-hand side, you've got a measure of capability. So what that looks like is how much of your force, being personnel and equipment, is available and how well trained is that force. What we've allocated here at the moment is baseline being around 40%, a minimum level of capability required to conduct your operational taskings being around 60%, an operational level of capability being what you require when you're at 100% of your entitlement for manning and personnel, being at 100%, and then anything above that being the consequences of training, the consequences of good leadership and morale, being that combat experience component. Now we're going to look at this over the 4 phases that we introduced right at the very beginning. The first being the preparation phase. So a unit in the preparation phase might start out as low as baseline and then continue over time conducting preparedness activities to improve themselves until they're at a higher level of readiness. This might go on for an extended period of time. This might go on potentially forever for some units, maintaining that readiness to be tasked for future operations. But today's talk is not about preparedness, it's about mobilisation. So we'll take that back and we'll look at what happens once a unit has been activated and needs to be put into a position to conduct an activity. So as you can see, as it moves into the mobilisation phase, its readiness increases as close to OLOC, or operational level of capability, as possible. From there, several activities will be conducted which will improve its readiness even further, up to OLOC and then even beyond. Those activities will get you ready to step off to conduct that operational activity. As we progress and you're deemed ready, you'll then be moved into operations. During the operations phase, activities will be conducted, potentially combat operations, and your readiness will degrade as you take casualties or potentially new tactics and techniques are used against you by your adversary. But after a period of time, you'll develop and continue to reconstitute until you're performing better. The final stage, or phase in this case, is demobilisation. Now in demobilisation, you can expect that your readiness will decrease quite significantly as you are stood down from the activity that you've been conducting. That might even mean a transfer of your material or expertise to another element. At the end of that phase, you then move back into preparedness as you get ready for the next activity. Now, I want to go into a little bit more detail with some specific real-world examples, so I'll hand over to Dave to cover those.
So let's look again at a simple example of a unit, and let's look at an infantry battalion for this one. So we start the year, as you can see on the slide, at a level at about the minimum level of capability. And here we've just had a posting cycle, perhaps there's a lot of leadership changeover. There needs to be some more relationships formed and times with teams. And that begins the beginning of the year. From there, this battalion determines that it has a progression of training, as every unit would do at the beginning of the year, to build through the Army training levels and standards. And in this case, in our example, that sees them complete their highest level of training during Talisman Sabre. It happens to be a Talisman Sabre year. They complete Talisman Sabre, and that's the highest level of readiness. They've now practiced everything that they've been rehearsing for the year. That would then see, as the case is in many battalions, a requirement then to reinvest in individual training to round out the year. And for an infantry unit, that's support course period. That sees, naturally, teams change over the posting cycle when that's concluded. And at the beginning of the following start of the year, the unit finds itself at a lower level of readiness, but not as low as it started the year before. There could be benefits like some of the soldiers participating in support courses were instructed by NCOs that have now become their section commander, or perhaps the leadership in some of the company headquarters hasn't changed as much. And so you're at a higher standard. And from there, the unit goes through, as it did the previous year, that escalation of training, moving through Army training levels and standards. But on this occasion, it's to do a warfighter activity where the Combat Training Centre takes the battalion through it. They're very fortunate. Once that event's been over, has concluded, and that new level of readiness has been achieved with a new high level of collective training, the unit is then ready to assume Ready Battle Group responsibilities. And of course, in this simplified example, we've removed some of the other factors, not to reduce their importance, like confirming that the standard of training is uniform and that everyone has all of the essential components so that the whole team is ready for Ready Battle Group. So once it assumes that, that begins the mobilisation phase, and the team commences on a readiness notice. They have a readiness notice now, and they appreciate that the sorts of tasks they might be employed as a Ready Battle Group. And so that allows them to do mission-specific training, which, extra things tailored for the sorts of missions they might get. And this also comes with extra resources, so there's an increased opportunity to go above that operational level of capability. Once they've been through that training, they deploy, and they're on those operations. And as Zach mentioned, while doing those operations, naturally attrition and a slight degradation in readiness will occur as casualties and other factors impact the force. But they'll learn from the experience, they'll receive reinforcements, they'll improve their tactics, techniques and procedures as they further understand the adversary, and they will go through a reconstitution where they increase their readiness. And that continues until such time as naturally is the case, this unit is going to complete their operations and finalise their activities, perhaps to be replaced in that operation. And that will see them go to a return to Australia and a demount. I'll call out one particular point in addition to Zach's. While this demount's occurring, equipment is being handed back, it's actually going on more often than not to another unit, not represented in our chart today, which actually would be in the mobilisation phase and then is benefiting from that equipment, but also the experience that this team gained from their operation, as there might be a transfer of skills and knowledge that is that extra factor to get above the operational level of capability and improve the following unit's combat experience. So there are benefits even to this phase. But we're here to talk about mobilisation. So let's go dive into mobilisation in particular. I mentioned mobilisation starts with the readiness notice starting, and naturally that starts with a recall. During the recall, the organisation will physically see and account for every person that will potentially feature on the operations to follow. That's the first time where everyone is there. It's an opportune moment for a commander to provide some intent, and it really sets the scene for this busy and eventful phase of mobilisation. After a recall has happened, something that might happen is there's extra equipment, specialist equipment, that is above the operational level of capability because it's not routinely called for in day-to-day. That might be live body armour, that could be CBRND equipment, and a number of other things, perhaps less than lethal ammunition natures above what would normally be allocated to be expended each training year. And that's useful because that accelerates their readiness and improves it. The next step, and I briefly mentioned it, was mission-specific training. And for our fictional battalion here, that could be an increased amount of crowd control training. It could be using those new less than lethal ammunition natures that perhaps people were competent on but can improve their proficiency with, as it's aspects like that will increase the performance of the team. So they would do scenarios where they would have taken the advice and analysis from perhaps their intelligence cell to inform a training progression inside this mobilisation phase to improve their performance ready for operations. After that's happened, it's often important to do a mission rehearsal activity. And here, the gold standard is usually an external assessor who is able to bring in additional resources, comes in and assesses a full mission profile or mission-specific event to truly test in conditions that are as close as we can achieve to the environment where they'll be operating in. And this is important. Once that's happened and any remediation has occurred, the team is at its highest level of readiness to deploy. And that's an opportune moment for a commander to force ashore that they have done everything they can to as best prepare the forces, and then that allows often a functional commander to certify the force to confirm that they are comfortable with this team to deploy. So that explains more detail on that. I now hand over to Zach to discuss a little more about the resourcing required to do that process.
Okay, so mobilisation is inherently a resource-intensive activity. There are a bunch of ways for us to consider the resource requirements for mobilising, but one of the easier and more upfront ways is to use the fundamental inputs to capability. Now, most of you will be at least somewhat familiar with this from the Raise, Train, Sustain organisation, as these are the resource inputs that we tend to see at our level as well. But in mobilisation, they're also called the mobilisation factors, things you have to consider as part of it. Now, if you have a look at the screen, you'll see along the bottom the 9 fundamental inputs to capability, ranging from personnel through to industry. You'll also see stacked behind them the 3 levels of mobilisation that we'll be discussing as part of this, being selective, partial, and then full. National mobilisation becomes a very complex and external activity that is reliant on a lot of government-specific interactions, so we're going to leave that one out for this particular discussion. So first of all, having a look at the selective mobilisation. As you can see, you're not going to have everything, and in fact, some things are going to be at quite low levels. But you will have certain things. So for example, you might be sitting at 60 to 70% of your personnel and a similar, if slightly more advanced amount of your platforms available to you. But what you will guarantee is that high level of collective training, because we can really focus on those selected units that are going overseas. Areas that you might have challenges is in supply and in support, particularly maintenance and specialty support, coming in to support your selective activity, because these are always tasked over an extremely broad base of activities that are occurring. Now, when we advance towards a partial mobilisation, you can see that some things have changed here. So for example, you can see a fairly significant increase in personnel as we weight our effort towards these operational activities, and an increase in support from industry as they start to recognise that there is in fact a problem that they can step in and assist us with, and they can provide us with those solutions. You'll also note that some things will drop or remain fairly stagnant. So for example, collective training is likely to be less available as more and more units require it, and facilities and training areas are likely to remain fairly stagnant, as these are not things that we can get in short notice. But overall, you can expect that components like command and management using our currently in place systems will improve in efficiency and support provided, and our organisational ability to manage these things will start increasing. So that might look like, for example, the provision of those joint force headquarters to coordinate these activities. Now finally, when we move towards full mobilisation, you can see a lot of things will increase as we can start to tap into the Australian support base. So this includes, for example, a real focus from industry on supporting our activities, because it's in their best interest for us to defend Australia's interests. You can also see a dramatic increase in support as we start to bring new capabilities online and bring people back in to provide support that otherwise would be quite difficult to retain. And you'll also see quite a significant increase in personnel as we commit almost all, if not all, of the forces that Australia has towards this. So this just gives you, again, a simplified concept of how we would gain the resources that we need as part of this. And from here, what we'd like to do is just finish up by going through some of the challenges that we face. Now, there's 3 key challenges we'd like to speak to. The first is shortages. So during COVID-19, we all saw the impact of supply shortages on our families. The ADF is not immune to these supply shortages, particularly with fuel and ammunition. Mobilisation will require expansion to the volume of supplies we might need. And there are smart people in industry and government who are working on these problems right now.
Another aspect of potentially shortage is the availability of platforms. As we know, there are a finite number of platforms, and some of them don't feature on any production line at the moment, should we need them more quickly. For example, some of the future vehicles offer fantastic capability, but as yet, some of them are perhaps not yet being produced, and that could create some shortages should we need them. Our second challenge is scaling. Should we need to expand the force, we need the command and control, or the headquarters, to be in place to lead and manage our new team, or our expanding team. Fortunately, Army is addressing this with the creation of new headquarters, such as the 9th Brigade. This provides a baseline framework for scaling, and it is a great start. The other side of the coin is hollowness.
We have all seen the impacts of hollowness, particularly over the last few years. Hollowness means incomplete teams, and incomplete teams make it harder for us to mobilise. They require people to be removed from other teams to make a whole. This is less time with teams, and as a result generates a lower readiness level. Now, the third challenge is risk acceptance. One major issue of expanding the force rapidly is governance risk. As we expand our use of supplies, we will experience a degree of wastage. We must develop a tolerance for the governance risk this represents within reason. This includes reducing red tape wherever possible.
The last aspect of this is that as we stress the force within the stages of mobilisation, it may become a time where we need to compromise on some things. Commanders will be required to select options that are not perfect, and this may increase governance risk. But we need to be comfortable making these choices. Australia has a tradition of successfully mobilising forces when they are needed, and we've explained that and shown it. Army is well placed to continue supporting operations and building contingency forces. Your chance to be part of this journey may not be too far around the corner. And that concludes our presentation, our discussion on mobilisation. We hope you've taken something away, and we'd now like to take questions.
Our first question is from Warrant Officer Class 2 James Long at 1 RAR. Now, during the mobilisation phase, you have listed recall, mission-specific training, MREs. What base time frame would this be completed over? And could elements of this be achieved during the prep phase? Or do you see elements of being able to achieve some of these during the prep phase?
So it's a great question, and certainly from a place that would have been through what has been described today. I've found the case that every unit in Army is keen to do everything that they can to be prepared for whatever may arise. And because of that interest and focus, more often than not, they will be doing things as early as they're able to do so. And the benefit of that is whatever you can do now will save you time later. So I'm certain that there will always be opportunities for units to do things that are likely to be important into their futures, so that they can save space for what is unexpected. So for example, an important skill set that we've seen in recent history is crowd control. Now, it takes some time to develop sufficient skills to be effective at crowd control, as it needs a large number of soldiers and officers to undertake crowd control, because it's about the mass. That journey could be started earlier than the mobilisation phase, and it needs to. So that is something that could be done and is often done very well.
I might just briefly jump into that as well and mention there's an aspect of culture to this too. So if you can generate a good readiness culture in your unit, you can shortcut a lot of these things. However, you just have to be careful that you don't overstep the readiness notices that are provided to us by our higher headquarters. The reason for that is there's only so many resources across the organisation, and there's only so much time, and there's only so many soldiers, and we can't afford to burn our guys out by over-preparing. So this has to be a really clear conversation between the two.
Thanks very much. Excellent. We have another question from here in the room. You spoke about how a unit might go from the preparation phase to the mobilisation phase, but it wasn't clear on what the triggers might be for that to occur. So how does a unit go from preparation to mobilisation for an activity?
So in the framework we described, it would be apparent before entering mobilisation, and to continue the Ready Battle Group concept, it would be apparent before the arrival of the time when a battalion or a unit assumes that responsibility that they would be doing it. And so there would be a mounting directive or an order coming from higher, and in our instance, that might come from the highest levels, as that organisation is employed by the Chief of Joint Operations. So there is often sufficient forecasting time to understand that that is coming. And as well, there is usually a date and a notice to move introduced as part of that orders. So it would go from Joint Operations Headquarters down through Headquarters Forces Command, through the formations to the unit. And the benefit of that system is that because it is an organisation that includes a number of different personnel from different brigades and battalions, as it trickles down, it provides an opportunity to bring together the team and set the date where they are force concentrating and to commence their preparation.
It's also important to note that this direction just doesn't come from anywhere. Government needs to provide direction for any of these activities and provide that basically direction to the Defence Force to act. And so once that direction has been provided, we then go through this. And we do have specific forces on specific notices to move as per the direction from the CDF, based on the guidance he receives from government, to be able to enact this on relatively short notice.
Thank you. We have another question from in the room. For a unit that isn't the Ready Battle Group, but may want to be ready to take on short notice tasks that might be available, what sort of things can a non-Ready Battle Group unit do to improve their readiness outside of being assigned as a specific contingency force element?
This links back to my previous comments about culture. You can create a culture of activity before you actually need to start mobilising. And that's as simple at the lowest levels as making sure that your DP1 checks are correct, that your vehicles are correctly managed and maintained, that your skill sets are in place, and that your family situation supports you being away for long periods of time on very short notice. I think all these things combine to put you in a position where your chain of command can then focus on the training that will really help you and increase your ability within the resource constraints that you have before you're even selected for an activity. It's also important to stay up to date, particularly with intelligence. I know that this is a particular issue now that the brigades are allocated to specific areas, and we're trying to address that by letting our intelligence cells focus and creating better linkages to our higher headquarters to pass that information down as well.
If I could add as well, the hardest part of this journey is that final 1 or 2%. It's because we seek the most complete teams and we want, where we can, to have all of the training that's needed for all of the members, as well as all of the other gates that are required to be an optimally ready team. It's important to focus on ensuring that that's done as early as you're able. So for example, because of the way that Army is implementing training, much of it is fantastic for things like the Army Combatives Program, enhanced combat shooting, and other systems. There is a need to doubly confirm that everyone has the qualifications that they need to fill roles that may require those skills. And the finding is, sometimes unexpectedly, some members do not yet have those qualifications. So if you can get that last couple of percent of the large group, every person has precision of the skill sets required, that will pay the biggest dividend later.
Thanks very much. And we do have one final question. You mentioned that collective training won't be as high during partial mobilisation as it is during selective mobilisation. Why do collective training levels drop just because forces are being more mobilised?
So this one comes down to resources in the end. We only have so many resources allocated to our collective training agencies, and there's only so much a brigade headquarters can do when it's starting to try and raise forces before they go off, whilst also conducting its primary role of raise, train and sustain. So when it comes down to it, the standard across the board won't be allowed to drop, but the volume of collective training might have to. So instead of a mission ready exercise or a mission ready activity that goes for a month, we might only be able to afford a laser focused week with a particular group. And I feel as though that will put us in a position where we're doing the best we can with the limited resources we have, and it will improve over time, but there will certainly be a degradation as we move up those stages in the overall volume of collective training that's able to be conducted.
On behalf of the Cove and the Cove audience, I'd like to thank you both, Zach and Dave, for joining us this afternoon to talk about a very timely topic. So thank you very much for your participation. It was very interesting.
Thanks very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our Cove live stream. Thank you for joining us. Once again, don't forget to follow the Cove on social media and download the Cove app and enable notifications. Thank you.